the selection mechanisms that determine what happens to you in relationship to the next generation, say, are selecting you on the basis of your action and your behavior. I would say they're selecting you on the basis of your values. So, because, you know, if you're an idiot, say, and you go charging after a lion and the lion eats you, then the nature of reality, so to speak, is rendered a judgment on the value structure that sent you down that particular path, right? And so, you're being selected by natural forces as a consequence of your behavior. Now, and then we can extend that argument, especially in the human case, or in the case of any organism that's also subject to sexual selection. And human beings are tremendously subject to sexual selection. Now, Darwin was a great believer in sexual selection. You know, he thought it was at least as important as the selection of the organism by the natural environment, whatever that is. But, you know, biologists really had a hard time with that, and they kind of ignored sexual selection for like 100 years, which is quite interesting. I think it was partly because sexual selection implies, especially when you're dealing with organisms that are sort of conscious like human beings, that choice itself is a determinant of evolutionary processes. And you know, the strict deterministic materialists didn't really like that, and they couldn't really come up with an argument against it, but they sort of shelved the whole topic for a very long period of time. But one of the things we know, for example, about human beings is that females are very sexually selective. Female humans, as opposed, say, to female chimps, which aren't. So part of what's occurred to select human beings for the way they are is the choices that each gender has made with regards to action and belief, but in many ways, more specifically, female choices. So it's kind of interesting. The next time you're irritated at your boyfriend, let's say, then you can just remember that, you know, untold millions of women have chosen men so that they're exactly like he is. And so, you know, you can't really blame him for that. So, all right, so, but here's the thing that's tricky from a scientific perspective, eh? If it is your behavior and your value structures, if your value structures determine what you're interested in, how you behave, and selection pressure occurs as a consequence of your actions, then doesn't it mean that the structure of the value systems that drive your behavior have to be regarded as true or real in some scientific sense? Because the Darwinists basically say, look, the best solution is the solution that you embody. There is no higher solution than that. And there you are, embodying a solution. So in what way, I don't understand in what way that can't be regarded as real. You know, because people think of things like value structures as epiphenomenal. You know, they're not real like material is real. But I don't get that. I don't see how that works with Darwinian thinking, because you're interacting with each other all the time, and you're doing that on the basis of your capacity for action and the value systems that drive that. And obviously, those have some effect on whether or not you're selected. By women, say, or by men for that matter, but also by the natural world. So, it looks to me, at least you can make a case, that the deep value structures that drive us, that are deep parts of our psyche, and I'll try to also demonstrate to you that those exist beyond question. I already think that question is answered, but, you know, there's no blank slate theorists left, right? Everybody knows that you come into the world with an a priori structure. It's like that a priori structure was selected. So in what way is it not true? I could say, well, it's as true as it gets. Well, it's not true like a materialist idea, but that's okay. You don't have to have... First of all, I don't think the materialist ideas of truth are the most fundamental ideas, because, as I said, in order for that truth to be relevant, it has to be grounded in a value system. And so there's a value system outside of science that science serves. Otherwise, we'd be completely... It would be insane for us to pursue it, you know. If we knew that science was going to lead to the demise of everyone on Earth, which it could, we wouldn't be motivated to pursue it. If you knew that science was just going to increase your suffering, if you're a scientist, it's like, well, you'd stop doing it if you had any sense. So then I would say, well, we pursue materialist truths for reasons that are non-materialist, and those reasons are just as real as the materialist truths, but they're a different kind of true. They're a seriously different kind of true.
These selected value systems are giving us an idea of what's true in your theory. Does that mean what's
It's a good question. You know, I would say they change at least to some degree, you know, because, you know, I don't know what values you share with the primate who was your ancestor and the ancestor of chimpanzees. But I would say there's no shortage of similarities. You know, I mean, first of all, we can understand chimps, you know, more or less. We can understand dogs, we can understand cats. My daughter had lizards, and the more social lizards, there are social lizards, by the way, you can kind of understand a social lizard. You know, so we certainly understand all mammals. And then there are other animals that we have deviated from at far greater spans of time. I like the example of crustaceans because I happen to know a little bit about lobsters for reasons that where my reading took me in a random direction. But like lobsters organize themselves into dominance hierarchies. If a lobster has lost a fight, then he like zooms into his little lobster place and like pouts for at least 20 minutes. He won't fight with anyone else during that period of time, and when he comes out he's like a smaller lobster, you know, because he sort of determines how big to be on the basis of the ratio of victories to defeats. And the mechanism that adjusts his posture, the successful lobster takes up more and more space because he says, I'm as big as I think I am, and that's based on my success in battle. That's serotonergically mediated as well. You know, and so when you see a human being that's like this, you know, taking up as little space as possible, you can think, well, there's a defeated lobster, because it's exactly the same mechanisms. And they're really fundamental in human beings, and you can't really change them, you know. Like, the way your brain computes your dominance affects how much positive emotion you have and how much negative emotion. And if you're way the hell down in the dominance hierarchy, or you feel that way, then you're going to experience way more negative emotion because your nervous system has calculated that the environment on average is very dangerous to you because you're barely clinging to the edge of reality. And you're going to experience very little positive emotion because, well, things don't look that good for you. And so, you know, and those aren't really systems you can control. They're like master operating systems that sit at the base of your brain, you know. And so you say, well, do things change across time? It's like, yes, but they change within constraints that don't change much across time. So, for example, I think probably as much, it's reasonable to assume that there's as much conservation of value as there is retention of skeletal structure. You know, and I went at least that much. I think there's actually more, but certainly there's at least that much. I went to the Smithsonian at one point. I think it was the Smithsonian in Washington, and they have a display of mammalian skeletons in there that's extremely extensive. So it's everything from little bats to whales, and you know, it's really interesting to walk through that because what you see is that everything's basically a bat. You know, the bats look exactly like us skeletally, except their fingers are way longer, and you know, all that's happened is that there are transformations of size in the basic skeletal structure. The structure itself is virtually identical across mammals. You know, and so an evolution is a conservative process, right? It just doesn't go zipping off in some completely random direction. And so I would say also, the way to think about it is that there are levels of stability in the evolutionary process. And some domains are extremely stable across time. And one of them happens to be the existence of a dominance hierarchy. It's at least 400 million years old. And that's old. It's older than trees. So if you're trying to think about what's actually real, you know, you can't see a dominance hierarchy and you can't taste it or touch it or sense it in any real way. But dominance hierarchies are more real than almost anything that you ever come across. They're probably not quite as real as rocks. But they're real enough so that both you and lobsters organize yourself into them and understand them. And so yes, there's change, but it's change within constraints. And I think maybe one of the ways to understand that is it's something like the variation in languages. You know, are languages the same or different? Well, it depends on your level of analysis. There are levels of analysis at which the commonalities are what's most manifest, and there are levels of analysis where the differences are most manifest. But I like to think about it as a hierarchy, and there's fundamental elements at the base of the hierarchy, and they don't change. They're, you know, life made a bet 400 million years ago, and it was one of those bets that's just not going to change. The dominance hierarchy is something that's going to feature a lot in our conversations because it's such a stable element of the environment that it's one of the its existence and its nature is one of the fundamental presumptions of our being. And so it's extremely important. So for example, one of the things that women do with men, and men do it with women as well, but they use different criteria, is men are very competitive in a certain manner. And the women assume that the guys who win are the better men, and they just peel them from the top. And so the dominance hierarchy, in part, female selection is one of the things that determines whether male genes of a particular type go into the future. But so is the structure of the dominance hierarchy. Because if you're at the bottom of it, I mean, good luck finding a partner. It's very, very unlikely unless it's random and impulsive. So, or involuntary.